Before the flood, before the ark, before the waters rose and swallowed everything whole, there was a world the Bible describes in fragments and then buries in silence. 17 centuries of human history, and the Bible covers them in less than 6 chapters. 6 chapters, and then silence. What went under? What was erased? And why does it matter to you right now in the world you are living in? Most people read Genesis the way they read fine print. Quickly, impatiently, looking for the parts that seem to matter. But the parts they skip, those are the parts that change everything. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. One sentence. And inside that sentence, a historical impossibility so enormous that most readers walk past it without blinking. Cain, the first murderer, the cursed wanderer, built a city. The Bible says it like it is the most natural thing in the world. It is not. And within 4 generations, metallurgy, music, architecture, 3 technological revolutions buried inside a genealogy that most people skip entirely. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969. These are not poetry. The Hebrew text records them with clinical precision. And before you dismiss them, consider this. The ancient Sumerian King List, a document from a culture with no reason to corroborate the Bible, records pre-flood kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. Different numbers, identical concept. That is not coincidence. That is the fingerprint of shared memory. Then Genesis chapter 6 arrives. 6 verses. The most suppressed passage in the entire Old Testament. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they took them. 200 of them. They descended on Mount Hermon and swore an oath together, because each one was afraid to go through with it alone. These were not primitive spirits. These were beings with full moral awareness, making a deliberate choice. Their crime was not only what you think it was. The Book of Enoch lists their transgression by name, and it was educational. They transmitted forbidden knowledge to a humanity that was not ready for it, and the world was never the same. The Nephilim, mighty men of old, men of renown. The Hebrew word means fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. And the Book of Enoch describes what a world dominated by them actually looked like. More than 200 cultures separated by oceans tell the same story. Beings from a higher realm came down. They bred with humanity. They produced a race of extraordinary power, and the result was catastrophe. Are they all wrong? Or are they all remembering the same event? Genesis chapter 6, verse 12, God looked at the earth and saw that all flesh had corrupted its way. The Hebrew word is shachath, ruined, destroyed, made unrecognizable. This was not ordinary sin. This was alteration at the level of what living things were. And then the sentence was spoken, not a punishment, a surgery, a reset so total that it required the undoing of creation itself, from the foundations of the earth upward. 150 days, a world entirely beneath water, every city, every forge, every monument, every secret, compressed into sediment, erased with a thoroughness that was itself intentional. But the memory did not drown. It could not. It was carried inside the only 8 people left alive on earth. And when they had children, the memory traveled. It fractured. It scattered across every culture on earth, waiting to be reassembled. Plato called it Atlantis. The Sumerians encoded it in their King List. The Egyptians called it Zep-Tepi, the first time. The Greeks remembered Prometheus. The Maya remembered the feathered serpent. More than 200 traditions, one origin. Jesus said it plainly, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the coming of the Son of Man. He was not speaking about rain, he was speaking about this, about what you're about to hear. The question is whether you are ready to listen. But first, the lifespans, because those numbers are not decoration and they are not mythology. Adam lived 930 years. Seth lived 912. Methuselah, the oldest recorded human being in the entire Bible, lived 969 years. The Hebrew text records these figures with the same precision it uses for everything else, methodical, deliberate, almost clinical. And before you dismiss them as legend, consider this: the ancient Sumerian King List, a document recovered from the ruins of Mesopotamia and written by a culture that had no theological reason to align with the Bible, records pre-flood kings who reigned for tens of thousands of years. The specific numbers are different. The concept is identical. Every ancient tradition that carries a memory of the world before the flood, Sumerian, Egyptian, Hindu, Mesoamerican, remembers it as an age when human beings lived incomprehensibly long lives. That convergence across cultures separated by oceans is not coincidence. That is the fingerprint of shared memory. What does living for 900 years actually mean for the transmission of knowledge? It means that Adam, the first man, was still alive when Lamech, Noah's own father, was born. It means the memory of Eden was not a legend passed down through dozens of generations of forgetful minds. It was a living memory, carried in the body of men and women who walked and breathed for centuries. The pre-flood world was not a collection of isolated tribes stumbling toward civilization in ignorance. It was a world saturated with direct, unbroken ancestral memory of a time when humanity stood in the presence of God, and it chose with full knowledge of what it was doing to walk in the opposite direction. That is not simply tragedy. That is something much darker. That is defiance with open eyes. Now consider what the Bible does not say, because the silence is as loud as anything written. It does not describe the architecture of those cities. It does not tell us what Tubal-Cain forged with his mastery of bronze and iron. It does not describe what a world of people living for 9 centuries built across 1,600 years of accumulated knowledge. It does not explain what the earth looked like, what systems of power governed it, what technologies arose from it, or what monuments it raised toward the sky. And that silence, precise, unbroken, total, is where this investigation begins in earnest. Because other texts do speak. Fragments survived the erasure. Traditions persisted across cultures that had no contact with each other. Whispers crossed oceans. And when you lay them side by side, something extraordinary begins to take shape. Not a primitive world of mud huts and stone tools, but something that required the direct intervention of God to unmake. The world that was is not truly gone. It left traces, and following those traces, is about to change the way you read every page of Scripture you have ever seen. Genesis chapter 4, verse 17. One sentence, 11 words in most English translations. And inside those 11 words, a historical impossibility so enormous that most readers walk past it without blinking. Here it is. Cain knew his wife. She conceived, and he built a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. That is it. No explanation, no architectural description, no account of how long it took or who helped build it. Just the quiet, almost casual statement that the first murderer in human history, a man placed under divine curse and condemned to wander the earth as a fugitive, stopped wandering long enough to build a city. Stop. Read that again. A city, not a shelter, not a camp, a city. And the Bible says it like it is the most natural thing in the world. Now let us think about what a city actually requires, because the word has been diluted by familiarity. A city requires a stable food supply, which means organized agriculture on a scale large enough to feed a concentrated population. It requires governance, a system of rules, authority, and enforcement that keeps thousands of individuals functioning as a single social unit. It requires division of labor, meaning that some people grow food while others build, others govern, others teach, others trade. It requires architecture, sophisticated enough to create permanent structures, which in turn requires knowledge of materials, load-bearing design, and construction technique. A city, in every meaningful sense, is not built by one man. It is the product of a civilization. And yet, there it is in Genesis 4, attributed to a man who, by the preceding narrative, should have been alone, cursed, and wandering. Something is missing from the story we have been told. The traditional answer is that Cain married a sister or a close relative, that other children of Adam and Eve had spread across the region, and that a small community gathered around him. That explanation is possible, but it does not resolve the deeper problem. Even granting a growing population, the construction of a city within the first few generations of human history demands a level of knowledge, organization, and technical capability that should not yet exist. Unless, of course, it did exist, inherited directly from the first human beings, who did not arrive on earth as helpless infants fumbling toward fire and the wheel, but as fully formed, intellectually complete individuals created by the mind of God Himself. Adam was not a primitive. Adam named every living creature, a taxonomic achievement that implies language, categorization, abstract thought, and memory systems complex enough to organize an entire living world. The children of Adam did not start from zero, they started from the top. Here is where the archaeology becomes deeply uncomfortable for the standard timeline of human development. The city of Jericho, widely considered by mainstream scholarship to be among the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth, has walls and towers that have been dated to approximately 9,000 BC, 9,000 years before Christ. That places organized urban construction thousands of years before the civilizations of Sumer and Egypt that we are taught to regard as the cradle of human achievement. And Jericho is not alone. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, a site of massive carved stone pillars arranged in precise circular formations, was built around 11,600 BC, before agriculture, before pottery, before anything in the conventional story of human development that should have made such construction possible. The official narrative says that hunter-gatherers with no permanent settlements and no surplus food production built one of the most sophisticated ritual complexes ever discovered. Does that make sense to you? Because it does not make sense to the archaeologists who excavated it either. The line of Cain did not stop at one city. Read the passage again slowly. Within 4 generations of Cain, his descendant Jubal became the father of all who play the harp and flute. His half-brother Tubal-Cain, and pay close attention to this name, was an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. Tubal-Cain, the father of metallurgy, the man who taught humanity to extract metal from stone, to forge tools and weapons, to work with materials that require temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius to manipulate. Mainstream archaeology tells us that the Bronze Age began approximately 3,300 BC and the Iron Age around 1,200 BC. But the Bible places both bronze and iron working within the first 10 generations of human history, inside the pre-flood world, attributed to a single family in the line of Cain. Either the Bible is wrong, or the timeline we have been taught is catastrophically incomplete. And then there is Lamech, Tubal-Cain's father, who in Genesis chapter 4, verses 23 and 24, recites what scholars call the Sword Song, a poem of vengeance addressed to his wives, boasting that he has killed a man for wounding him and a young man for striking him. Detain on that for a moment. Lamech does not just speak. He composes, he structures his words in parallelism, in rhythm, in the deliberate form of ancient Near Eastern poetry. This is a man inside the pre-flood world constructing literature, not grunting around a fire, not scratching marks in clay, but composing oral poetry with the conscious craft of a man who understands that words arranged in a certain order carry more power than words spoken plainly. That is not primitive. That is culture. That is civilization at a level of refinement that embarrasses the timeline we have inherited. The Book of Enoch, one of the most ancient Jewish texts outside the canonical Bible, preserved in full only in the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition and quoted directly by the New Testament Book of Jude, offers something the Bible does not, a name for what was being built in that pre-flood world. It describes the Watchers and their offspring, the Nephilim, as the force behind a technological and cultural acceleration that outpaced anything humanity should have been capable of on its own. It describes cities of a kind that would not be built. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. This is the verse that most people skip over because they think they already know what it says. They expect rain. They picture a heavy storm, dark clouds, rising rivers. But the text does not begin with rain. It begins with something far more violent, far more total, far more geological than a weather event. It says, "On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened." The fountains of the deep burst open first, not the sky. The earth itself ruptured. Whatever held the waters beneath the crust of the planet gave way simultaneously across the entire surface of the world. And the result was not a flood in any sense that word normally carries. It was a planetary restructuring. It was the earth being turned inside out by a force that originated not from above, but from below, from within, from the very foundations of the world that God had spoken into existence at the beginning. This was not weather. This was surgery. To understand the scale of what happened, you need to understand what the ancient world believed about the structure of creation. The Hebrew cosmology embedded in Genesis describes a world suspended between two bodies of water, the waters above, held back by the firmament of heaven, and the waters below, the Tehom, the great deep, restrained beneath the crust of the earth. When God created the dry land in Genesis chapter 1, verse 9, He gathered the waters into seas. He did not destroy them. He contained them. The pre-flood world existed inside a kind of hydraulic balance, with enormous reservoirs of water above and below the habitable surface, held in place by a divine architecture of containment. When the flood came, both systems failed at once. The windows above opened, the fountains below erupted. The containment that had made life possible for over 1,600 years was deliberately, systematically, and completely removed. That is not a flood. That is the reversal of creation itself. Now think about what this means for the civilization we have been describing across the previous chapters. Cities of bronze and iron, built across 16 centuries of accumulated knowledge and forbidden technology. Structures of a scale and sophistication that modern archaeology still struggles to explain, even in their ruined and submerged form. Populations that had lived for 8, 9, nearly 10 centuries, carrying within their living memories the direct inheritance of everything that had been built and taught and corrupted since the beginning. All of it in a period of 40 days of active flooding, followed by months of standing water, reduced to sediment. Not buried intact like Pompeii, not damaged and partially preserved. Disaggregated, scattered, driven into the geological record as layers of compressed material that later generations would dig up and label without understanding what they were actually looking at. The flood did not preserve the pre-flood world in amber. It erased it with a thoroughness that should itself be understood as intentional. The water rose for 40 days, but the earth did not dry for over a year. Genesis chapter 7, verse 24 says, "The waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days before they began to recede." 150 days of a world entirely beneath the surface of a global ocean. No mountains visible, no coastlines, no landmarks, nothing but water in every direction under a sky that had finally closed again. Inside the ark, 8 people and the biological archive of a world that was being unmade and remade beneath them. Imagine the sound. The creaking of wood under pressure that no human carpenter had ever designed for. The silence of a world where every voice that had ever spoken above the waterline was gone. The complete and absolute aloneness of being the only living witnesses to the death of an entire age of history. Noah and his family were not just survivors. They were the last people alive who remembered, however imperfectly, what had existed before the water came. And when the ark finally grounded on the mountains of Ararat, the world they stepped out into was not the world they had left. It was something new, something quieter, something emptied of everything that had made the old world what it was. But here is the question that the Bible raises and does not fully answer, and it is the question that has driven archaeologists, geologists, and theologians to distraction for centuries. Where did all that water go? The Earth's current surface has enough water to cover the entire planet to a depth of roughly 2,700 meters, if the ocean floors were leveled and the mountains flattened. The pre-flood world, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 19, saw waters that covered all the high mountains under the whole heaven. The text says, the waters rose 15 cubits above the mountains. That is a volume of water that exceeds anything the current hydrological cycle can account for. And the answer, buried in plain sight in Genesis chapter 8, verse 2, is that the fountains of the deep were closed and the rain from the heavens was restrained. The water did not evaporate. It went back into the reservoirs beneath the crust of the earth, back into the geological systems that were restructured by the very rupture that released them. The flood changed the architecture of the planet. The world after the flood was physically different from the world before it. Different atmospheric pressure, different axial tilt, according to some calculations, different distribution of land and sea, different climate patterns. The shortened lifespans recorded immediately after the flood in Genesis chapter 11 are not an anomaly. They are evidence of a world whose life-sustaining conditions had been fundamentally altered. And now, the convergence that cannot be dismissed. More than 200 independent flood traditions exist across cultures that had no contact with each other: Sumerian, Babylonian, Hindu, Chinese, Mesoamerican, Native American, Australian Aboriginal, Greek, Norse. They differ in names, in details, in the idea. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. Most people read this verse and picture rain. Heavy clouds, rising rivers, a violent storm that got out of hand. That image is not only inadequate, it is the wrong category entirely. The text does not begin with rain, it begins with rupture. It says that on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst open, and the windows of the heavens were opened. The fountains of the deep came first. The earth itself broke apart before a single drop fell from the sky. Whatever system of containment had held the subterranean waters in place since the third day of creation simultaneously failed across the entire surface of the planet. This was not a weather event that escalated. This was a geological catastrophe, of a kind the Earth has not experienced before or since, executing a plan that had been decided before the first board of the ark was ever cut. God did not lose control of the climate. He dismantled the architecture of the world he had made precisely and deliberately from the foundations upward. To grasp what this means, you have to understand the physical structure of the world as Genesis presents it. The Hebrew cosmology embedded in the creation account describes the habitable earth as existing between two great bodies of water held in containment by divine design. Above the firmament were the waters of heaven, the source of rain and dew, separated from the earth on the second day of creation. Below the land surface were the waters of the great deep, the Tehom, the same word used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, to describe the formless waters that existed before God began to speak order into chaos. When God gathered the lower waters into seas on the third day, he did not eliminate them. He restrained them. The pre-flood world was a planet in a state of managed hydraulic tension, with enormous reservoirs of water above and below the surface kept in balance by a structure that existed because God held it in place. The flood was what happened when he let go. Both systems failed simultaneously. The windows of heaven opened and the fountains of the deep erupted at the same moment as if synchronized by a single command, which of course they were. The rain lasted 40 days, but the waters prevailed on the earth for 150 days, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 24, before they began to recede. 150 days of a world completely submerged, no coastlines, no mountain peaks, no landmarks of any kind, in any direction, nothing above the surface of the water except the ark, moving on a featureless ocean that covered everything that had ever been built, named, inhabited, or remembered across 16 centuries of human civilization. Think about what that silence meant. Every city, every forge, every instrument, every text, every monument, every hybrid creature that had ever been produced by the corruption of the Watchers, every record of every king and every lineage and every forbidden secret that had been transmitted from supernatural beings to willing human hands. All of it underwater. All of it being compressed into the sedimentary layers that future geologists would one day core and sample and date without ever understanding what they were actually measuring. Now, consider the question that geology itself raises, but institutional is deeply reluctant to answer directly. Sedimentary rock formations cover approximately 75% of the Earth's land surface. Sedimentary rock is formed by the rapid deposition and compression of material underwater. It does not form slowly over millions of years in dry conditions. It forms quickly under catastrophic hydrological pressure, exactly the kind of pressure that a global flood lasting over a year would produce across every surface of the planet simultaneously. Billions of fossilized creatures are found in these layers, preserved in positions of sudden burial, fish fossilized in the act of eating, amphibians preserved mid-stride, entire ecosystems captured in a single stratum as if frozen in an instant by a force that gave nothing time to decompose before it was buried. The mainstream geological framework explains this through a model of slow, uniform deposition over hundreds of millions of years. But the pattern of the evidence, catastrophic, simultaneous, global, fits the flood model with a precision that uniformitarian geology has never fully resolved. The Earth remembers what happened to it. The question is whether we are willing to read that memory correctly. And then there is the water itself. Where did it all go? The surface of the Earth today contains enough water to cover the entire planet to a depth of roughly 2,700 meters, if all the topographic relief were removed. Genesis chapter 7 verse 19 says, "The waters covered all the high mountains under the whole heaven by 15 cubits." That represents a volume of water vastly exceeding anything the current visible hydrosphere contains. The answer is in Genesis chapter 8 verse 2. The fountains of the deep were closed. The water did not evaporate into space. It returned to the subterranean reservoirs from which it came, through the same rupture points that released it, as the geological pressure equalized. But the world it returned to was not the world it had left. The flood permanently altered the physical structure of the planet. The mountain ranges that now pierce the clouds were thrust upward by the tectonic forces unleashed when the fountains of the deep burst open. The ocean basins deepened to receive the returning waters. The atmospheric conditions that had sustained 900-year lifespans were gone, replaced by a thinner, harsher environment that would reduce human longevity within a few generations to something approaching what we experience today. The flood did not just kill the pre-flood world. It physically buried the conditions that had made it possible. Now lay the global testimony alongside the biblical record, because the convergence is impossible to dismiss on rational grounds. The Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, inscribed on clay tablets recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal and dating in their written form to the 7th century BC, describes a flood sent by the gods in which a single man named Utnapishtim is warned in advance, builds a vessel to specific dimensions, loads it with animals and his family, survives a catastrophic inundation, lands on a mountain, and sends out birds to determine whether dry land has appeared. The structural parallels with Genesis are not thematic. They are sequential and specific. The Sumerian flood narrative is older still, preserved on a tablet known as the Eridu Genesis, and tells the same story with the same essential architecture. The Hindu Shatapatha Brahmana describes Manu, warned by a fish that turns out to be the god Vishnu, who builds a boat, survives a world flood, and becomes the father of a new human race. The Mesoamerican Popol Vuh records a destruction of a previous humanity by flood replaced by the current race of men. The Chinese tradition preserves the memory of Gun and Yu, figures associated with a great flood and a divine mandate to restore order to a world submerged in water. More than 200 independent traditions across every inhabited continent carry the core memory. There was a flood. It was total. One family survived it, and the world that came after was different from the world that came before. That is not mythology diffused from a single cultural source. That is the echo of a real event, preserved in the deepest memory of every branch of the human family, fractured by time and distance, but pointing back always to the same catastrophic origin. What went under the water is the question that modern oceanography has only begun to approach. The continental shelves thus surrounding every major landmass are submerged landscapes, river valleys, coastal plains, and in some cases, anomalous formations that resist purely geological explanation. The floor of the Persian Gulf, now underwater, was dry land within a time frame consistent with post-flood geography and shows evidence of river systems and habitation. The Black Sea Basin shows evidence of a catastrophic inundation event that converted a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. And scattered across the floors of shallow coastal waters on multiple continents are structures that no known natural process has satisfactorily explained. Regular geometries, aligned formations, worked surfaces, sitting in the silence of the deep, neither confirmed nor refuted, waiting with the patience of things that have already survived one end of the world. The flood erased the pre-flood civilization from the surface of the earth, but it could not erase it from the memory of every culture that descended from the 8 people who stepped off an ark onto a mountain and began again. The story survived because the story is true, and the story matters now more than it has in centuries for reasons we are about to reach. The flood ended. The water receded. The ark grounded on the mountains of Ararat, and 8 people stepped out onto a world scrubbed clean of everything that came before. But here's what nobody tells you about what happened next. The memory did not drown with the old world. It could not drown because it was carried inside the only 8 people left alive on earth, and those 8 people had children, and their children had children, and within a few generations, the population of the new world was growing again, carrying inside its collective memory the fractured, compressed, but indestructible recollection of what had existed before the water rose. You cannot erase a story by destroying most of the people who remember it. You can only scatter it. And a scattered memory does not disappear. It mutates, travels, attaches itself to new languages and new landscapes until it becomes unrecognizable as the original. Yet when you lay all the versions side by side, the shape underneath is always the same. The pre-flood world was not forgotten. It was hidden inside everything that came after it. Consider Plato. In the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher recorded in 2 of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, the account of a conversation between the Athenian statesman Solon and an Egyptian priest at the temple of Sais. The priest told Solon that the Greeks were children in terms of historical memory, because catastrophes had repeatedly reset their records while the Egyptians had preserved their archives across thousands of years. Then the priest described a civilization that had existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, a great island empire beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the modern Strait of Gibraltar, swallowed by the ocean in a single day and night of catastrophic destruction. He called it Atlantis. For centuries, scholars have debated whether Plato invented the story as philosophical allegory or preserved a genuine historical tradition. But the details he recorded, advanced metallurgy, the hybridization of divine and human bloodlines, the moral corruption that preceded the destruction, the sudden submersion beneath water, align with the pre-flood world of Genesis with a precision that allegory alone cannot explain. Plato was not inventing. He was remembering imperfectly through 9,000 years of distortion the world that Genesis describes with theological exactness. Now look at the Sumerian King List, one of the most extraordinary documents ever recovered from the ancient Near East. It records the kings who reigned before the flood with lifespans of tens of thousands of years, then registers the flood as a historical event, and immediately resumes listing post-flood kings with dramatically shortened reigns. The document does not treat the flood as myth or legend. It treats it as a chronological dividing line, the boundary between 2 ages of the world, each with its own character and its own time scale. The Sumerians knew that something fundamental changed when the water came. The cities they built at Ur, Eridu, and Uruk, the cities that archaeology identifies as the earliest evidence of civilization, were in their own telling not the beginning of human achievement. They were a reconstruction, a partial, diminished, necessarily incomplete reconstruction of something older that had been lost. The cradle of civilization was already grieving a world it could only half remember. Here is what must be said clearly before this ends, because clarity matters more than comfort when the stakes are this high. The story of the pre-flood world was not preserved across 200 cultures and encoded in the structure of the Bible and carved into the stones of every ancient civilization on earth as an academic curiosity. It was preserved because it is a warning, not a warning about ancient people who made ancient mistakes in an ancient world. A warning about a pattern, specific, identifiable, and repeatable, of human civilization accelerating beyond its own moral and spiritual foundations. Under the influence of knowledge it was never designed to carry, until the weight of what it builds collapses everything it was built upon. That pattern ran its full course once. God interrupted it with water. The rainbow of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 13, was a covenant never again by flood. But the warning of Matthew chapter 24 was never rescinded. Jesus did not say it would be prevented. He said it would be recognized by those who had eyes trained to see the pattern. The history you have heard today is not behind you. The question it leaves you with is not historical. It is personal. It is immediate. It is the same question that Noah answered not with words, but with obedience, with the willingness to look like a fool in a world that had long since decided God was not watching. What will you do with what you now know? Because the water is not coming again. But something is.